Jesse.
I'm well.
So I guess we'll get started. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We'll again start with intros and I guess kind of give a brief breakdown of what we'll be talking about today, and then Eden is going to lead us through, I don't know how to describe it, but I'll let you describe it. But I'm Ann Lewis. I'm based in Detroit. I'm an activist artist, and felt the need to have these conversations with folks that I know to be doing really good anti-racist work. So we're here, and we're here to help answer questions and lead you towards resources created by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We're not here to teach. We're here to let those voices speak and sort of guide people towards those writings and those resources. So, hi, thanks for being here.
Hey, my name is Kate DeCiccio. I'm an artist, educator, and cultural organizer based in Oakland. And I'm just really grateful these conversations have gone on. We're looking at, I don't know, is this like the 8th one we've done? Something like that? And yeah, I think it's really important that we're having these conversations in community where there's space for us to fumble and really own what it looks like to be in vulnerable space with one another, because as we know, one of the mainstays in white culture is shame and judgment. And so I'm really happy to be here with y'all to unpack some of that tonight.
Hey everyone, this is Eden. I use their, she pronouns, and I am an organizer and activist also based in Detroit. And as always, really happy to be here in this space.
Jesse, you're on mute.
Muted.
I'm Jesse. I'm in Portland, Oregon. And yeah, I don't know. I'm so brain dead. I've been tear gassed more than I ever thought possible, and I think it's messing with my head. It's been really hard to focus, and my brain's been really foggy. So pardon me if I'm a little off today. But, hi.
You get all the passes.
Yeah. So today we're going to be trying to unpack and explore the toxicity of white culture and sort of the tools in which white supremacy uses culture and uses communication to maintain a racist status quo in our nation. Obviously, our country was founded on white supremacy, and that continues to be a guiding force in most everything that, society, government, social, you name it, there are levels in which white supremacy just infiltrates. So we're going to try to break some of that down today and, bring some awareness to some of the things that maybe folks haven't seen, haven't recognized, or didn't realize they were participating in, or if they did knowingly, sort of how to address and move forward from that. But Eden had a great idea when we were chatting about this talk today, so I'll let you take it.
Thanks, Anne. So normally we start, or I guess for the last few sessions, we have been starting by showing a video and sort of dissecting that. Today we're going to ask everybody to participate a little bit more actively here in sort of an imagining of what a good school is, or an ideal school, one that you would want the young people in your life to attend. And you can do this in whatever way like you process best, whether that be through like just kind of like sitting with your eyes closed and thinking through it. Maybe you want to drop some like comments in the chat. Maybe you want to write or like take notes on your notebook. Whatever it is, however you process, I just want you to kind of like actively engage with this. So what we're going to do is sort of picture what a good or ideal school is. And I'm going to ask some questions to guide our thinking on that. What does a good school look like? What's being taught? How is content being delivered? What does the building look like, both the inside and the outside? What do the classrooms look like? What's up on the walls? How do the students interact with one another? How do adults and students interact with one another? What role do parents and families play? When there's conflict, how does it get handled? I'm gonna put these questions actually in the chat. So I want us to, I know it's a little bit awkward because it's sort of like a webinar style, but I want us to think about these things for just a few minutes because that's a lot to digest. So dig into what that looks like for you. Okay. So thanks for participating in that. I'm going to ask another set of questions that are going to be rhetorical. So I actually don't want people to answer in the chat. I just want you to like think through these. I want you to ask yourself, did my vision for what I consider to be a good school explicitly include Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Did they include these people at every level? So when teachers were mentioned, did I envision Black, Indigenous, and POC teachers? When students were mentioned, did I envision Black, Indigenous, POC students? When parents and families were mentioned, did I envision Black, Indigenous, and people of color and families as well? And then even to dig beyond just like representation as far as these like people being present in your vision, when conflict was handled or was mentioned, was it handled in the way that it's always been handled for me? When curriculum was mentioned, was it Eurocentric curriculum or the type of curriculum that was presented to me in my school? And I think this activity for a lot of people envisioning a school probably just meant that we recreated a somewhat better version of the schools that we went to or that we send our kids to currently. And the reason behind this is because white culture sort of allows us to tell ourselves that we have schools, you know, we already have good schools and that Black, Indigenous, and people of color should have access to our good schools and assimilate to the culture of our good schools so that they can get a good job, so that they can live in a good neighborhood. When really what we should do is look at our schools with the understanding that if it was not designed with the active participation and the valued input of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or rather if it was only designed with white people's valued input and active participation, then it's actually not a good school. And the neighborhood that we moved into to send our kids to this school was not a good neighborhood. Sure, it might be highly resourced, highly amenitized, but it's culturally impoverished. Segregation isn't something that's bad for other people elsewhere that I can think of with a guilty conscience sometimes. It's also really, really bad for us on the privileged side of that as well. And until we start, once we start looking at that as being a really negative thing for us too, then we can move from this role of like allies, where we sort of like parachute in when it's convenient for us and parachute back out into our world of privilege, and start looking at it as our role as that of an accomplice. My skin is in this game too. So that's a lot of me talking, but I wanted us to kind of do like our own little biases check about what it looks like for us when we envision like good schools, good jobs, good neighborhoods, good whatever. And is that something that is centered around the toxicity of white culture or not?
Thank you, Eden. I feel like there's so much to unpack with just what you did. And to kind of piggyback on that, I've been exploring this in my own life and sort of how that comes up for me. And I think it's deeply rooted in just like our society is systemically racist. Like we've been socialized to be racist from the get-go, right? So like all of this is to say like, when we notice this, now we have the opportunity to change it. But I think a lot of white folks don't realize that they're participating in this sort of like these mental checks, right? And like when they think about a good neighborhood or where they want to send their kids to school, they're going to try to get into the best school possible. And lo and behold, that's always in a white neighborhood, right? And so based on oftentimes with schooling, it's, you know, tax-based and that sort of thing. And shocker, that's typically white neighborhoods because of all the things we talked about last week. So when we're sort of examining this with our own selves and our own communities, I think it's really important to sort of recognize that like, this isn't something that just you can like pretend it's not there or not participate in actively. I think there's a lot of times people participate in this unknowingly and unconsciously. And I think that can really be the root of all of this, because when you participate in unconsciously, you're not changing it and you're really unaware of yourself and how you're upholding white supremacy, right? And so when we think about this, that sort of white superiority that is enveloped in all of those like ideologies is something that has just been perpetuated forever. And until we really have deep looks within ourselves, like we're never going to step out of that, and we're never going to actively dismantle the delusion of white supremacy if we're not shifting those perspectives.
Yeah, and I think you bring up something that's really important that I think is also baked into this exercise, is the coded way in which we talk about things that have lots of racism couched inside of them. So last week we talked about the ways in which housing funds schools and how explicitly housing has been racist, and therefore the ways that explicitly schools that largely white children have access to are funded and resourced. But as related to language and our masking of racist undertones, you know, I think it's really important in this conversation when we're unpacking the ways in which we as white people, we know the words that we shouldn't say because they're explicitly racist, but the ways that we talk and instead what we're coding for to explain environments that largely are characterized by the absence of Black and brown people as the indicators that make us feel safe. We use your words like safety, good, you know, so like, is it a good school? Often means like, is that school, are the outcomes of that school testing that largely is testing that's designed to be delivered in a way that white kids do well. And that testing has outcomes so that we can access schools that have been identified by white people as elite schools that access us to networks to further our wealth. Similarly, like with communities, I can't tell you how many times when people find out that you live in Oakland, do you feel safe in Oakland? So truly, like what you're saying to me, like, oh, you live in Oakland, but what you're really asking is, Like, do you feel scared that you're going to be robbed by Black and brown people? That's what you're actually saying when you say, but we would never say that as white people, right? But because like amongst ourselves, we've created this value system where like collectively we've agreed that it's appropriate and it's okay for us to want to put our kids into good schools. We've collectively, like, our social contract is that we all have the right to feel safe. Even if that safety exists while jeopardizing other people's safety. And so in this conversation about like the inherent toxicity of the way that we interact with each other, a lot of that is baked into our communication.
Yeah, I think that brings up terminologies that have been kind of replaced because the rhetoric has changed like throughout the centuries here of like terms for, or racist terms for Black people or Black neighborhoods. And now it's like urban or ghetto, which are just racist terms. Like I remember people in San Francisco, like, oh, that area is ghetto. And I was like,
it's kind of sketchy over there.
Like, what do you mean? And I would go there and just be like young Black people hanging out. And it's like, these are just young Black people hanging out. Like, ghetto, what the fuck are you talking about? So that kind of rhetoric is like so ingrained. Like, I hate the word urban. It like drives me crazy. I feel like it's like such a blatantly racist term to describe like an area that like that white people aren't going to feel comfortable in.
Right. And it's also a word that gets used like when describing youth of color, largely to like code them as like being dangerous or like more like adults than they really are.
Yeah. And so I have a son, he's 11, and so all of this stuff brings up a lot of like what I've gone through as a parent. And my son is biracial, but he's very white presenting. And his mom was very adamant about like getting to a good school and to a good neighborhood, like yada yada. I've never been on that tip because I don't have the luxury of affording to. I live where I can. And so, but when I hear good neighborhood, good school, I get my alerts go off because I am automatically think that's not going to be diverse. And to me, diversity is safety. And I only feel like that we're going to grow as a species with diversity and with exposure to diversity and exposure to neighbors. And like I might go off on tangents because my brain is all over the place, but like when I lived in Los Angeles, everybody's driving everywhere in their cars, right? And so there was a lot of racial tension. In San Francisco, everybody rides the bus or the Muni or BART. And there was a lot less racial tension in the Bay Area because everybody's exposed to their neighbors through mass transit. And so same with like kids growing up. If they are exposed to all sorts of other folks, they're not going to have this racial tension. They're just going to be exposed and know that they are just other human beings. Nothing to be scared of, nothing to be, because kids can see the truth. Kids are so much more aware of truth and of they don't have all this jaded stuff like going on in their heads. So I think pushing diversity is like so important. And also I think we could tie this back, and I think that we really need to tie stuff back to why this all began. We began with defund the police, and this could be part of that conversation. Like defunding the police, we can put that towards schools to get better education, to pay teachers more, to get supplies, and that's a conversation that we need to be having. A lot of how this began has been co-opted and is going off in different directions, and a lot of the Black organizers are like, hey, hold the phone. Like let's bring this back in. Like we got to like defund the police. Black Lives Matter, and focus on that, you know? So defunding the police could be a really good way to talk about like how we could actually better our school systems and all systems, like top to bottom.
Jesse, you bring up a really good point about, you know, the beauty of diversity and how we actually like grow better as humans when we're in diverse circumstances. And something that has been on the top of my mind a lot, talking about sort of like the good school and these like, you know, how this coded language sort of basically speaks to segregation. And the consideration that a good school is an all-white school or a mostly white school, which means that all of the experiences and all of the personality and all of the people that could contribute to a space that is not white or interracial or diverse, when you talk about a good school and that codes for a white school, that means that there is no value given to the experiences and the benefits that Black, Indigenous, and people of color or children of color can contribute to those spaces. So like that to me was such a, like I hadn't thought about it in that structure of just like the loss that comes with segregation and the lack of beauty and life and joy and all of the things that come when you're like connected with all kinds of different people. And I really had to stop and think about like, when we're talking about something being good and that's like having like a massive absence of like all of these people and all of these experiences, like it really kind of struck me because I hadn't thought about it in that sense. I think that the coded language also for me, I think I was likely naive for a very long time, thinking I wouldn't think about it in those terms, but it was present. And I guess it was like, must have been very unconscious for me. And just to consider like, you know, how many people go through their lives thinking that an all white space is the best kind of space. Like, how horrific is that? And there is a question that I think links to this as well that's in the chat. Someone's asking, is white culture actually a thing though?
I wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, talk about that.
Well, even whenever the title to this episode came up of like toxic white culture, it's just like, well, what is American white culture? Like there is literally no culture. Like all of my ancestors were indigenous somewhere at some point, but I have zero ties to that. You know, like everything that is American white culture is based on genocide, slavery, and stealing. Like it's all
well, and
stolen.
capitalism.
Yeah, and it's all appropriated. You know, so like white
Right.
culture is just this extractive like monster. Like it does it without apology. It does it without like any sort of consideration, and nobody ever has to apologize because it's so ingrained into us that like, oh no, it's okay. That's white. That's safe. That's this. That's that. Because that's all we know, and we need to really start breaking that down and being like, I mean, we need to be calling bullshit on people, like, and it's starting to, but yeah, what is white culture? Like, let's talk about it.
Well, I think that what we've touched on both in here and both the things y'all are saying are like about the delusions that we internalize as a result of being in insulated white spaces. And so like when it's so normalized for us to be in all white spaces, that kind of becomes like ground zero of normalcy. And all of the values and norms of Eurocentric spaces, as well as the narratives that we've told ourselves about ourselves, when we're never amongst people who are asking us to critique the narratives that we've told ourselves about ourselves, it's really easy for us to believe that like our delusional or our warped sense of the world, because we only surround ourselves by other people, that like creates this kind of like echo chamber. I think that puts us in a real position where it creates this sense that whiteness is what normalcy is, instead of that like whiteness is in and of itself a racialized experience. And in America, when, you know, like Jesse said, we're all very, very disassociated from like, you know, generations back far enough so that like we knew when we were on our indigenous land, or the way that we became white in America. Largely we shed our cultural identities for the status of whiteness. And so, you know, many of we come from European backgrounds that of course had a strong sense of culture, but on behalf of separating ourselves for status, there was this blending, and then capitalism has been sold to us as culture, like that we can consume a sense of identity. And in that emptiness of not having a real sense of like positive cultural identity, and surrounding ourselves by just like each other, it's like we're like vanilla, and then other culture becomes a sense of commodity that we seek to consume. And I'm going to share this amazing piece by Bell Hooks about this dynamic of that like the othering of everyone else, and us kind of like seeking this sense of exoticism to be consumed, because we don't have real relationships outside of white spaces. And I think this is also related to when we're like dreaming big about what's the work that we can do that makes it possible for us to be in relationship with people. You know, part of diverse communities and white people living in diverse communities, we're dangerous to move into many communities because we rely on the police. And then that makes it so that we can't actually be in intimate relationship with non-white people because we're dangerous to them, where, you know, we need to be doing the work that allows us to exist in intimate relationship with other people. And that is where we find our sense of safety versus relying on systems that reinforce white supremacy. But all of this stuff is super connected, and doing the work of really being able to unpack the toxicity in which we operate in the world helps us to be able to operate in ways that remove us from these super insulated spaces, and allow us to be in fruitful relationship where we can then really see. It's like as soon as you begin to spend more time in non-white spaces, you have incredible perspective.
Yeah, and I think to that point about all white spaces and sort of how that's our baseline, I know I was raised in a culture where, you know, you don't, especially as a kid, and then I think you know, it starts there and then you grow from there, that like you don't challenge adults and you don't push boundaries and you don't speak or challenge people, particularly adults. And so when somebody says something racist, you've been trained by white supremacy through silence, through white silence, through this sort of like, you know, I grew up in Minnesota, the Minnesota nice thing. You don't challenge people and you don't want to make them feel like they're racist, so you don't say anything. And that's white solidarity. And when you participate in that, you are upholding white supremacy. And it, you know, I think a lot of people do it because they don't, especially in like a work setting, because they don't want to be seen as difficult. They don't want to lose their job. There's all of these like layers to why white people stay silent. And when you stop being silent, you break white rank. And when you do that, then folks start to turn on you and they call you difficult. They call you too politically correct. You can't take a joke. All of those levels of sort of diminishing you as somebody who may be problematic because you're not, staying on the team. I think there's a lot of layers to that I think most white folks grew up with. And then it's very hard to unlearn that because that was just your normal, right? So like being polite is so much more important than calling out a racist. When, you're like, I don't want to ruin dinner, but actually the racist is the one who ruined dinner, but nobody's saying about it. And all y'all are sitting there just like awkward and cringing, but nobody says anything. So it's already been ruined, so call it out. And I think like a lot of us just don't do that because it's uncomfortable, and that we have to shed that.
Well, and really because also our social code is like, we're inherently good. And so, I mean, even like, I think of like as a kid, so many times, like we, like you get stopped by the police and you're like, clearly like you're drinking, you have drugs, and this like, yeah, but you're like a good kid. And like, there's this contract amongst white people, this like wink and nod of that, like, yeah, like I see you though, like you're good. And we want to believe that about ourselves, and we don't want to disrupt that amongst each other. And I think this is also kind of like pretty good segue into our ideas, like when we leave white spaces, the way in which we feel comfortable leaving white spaces, and our sense of the savior complex, like the tropes of the white savior that are reinforced all throughout American culture, but also the ways that we do things like go on volunteer trips to Africa to reinforce our sense of goodness amidst our privilege without disrupting how it is that we see ourselves, where it's like, you can go to a place that's, a 20-hour plane ride, and the culture is different enough so that you can go there and actually never see you're like not asked so directly to see yourself in the mirror, and you can see yourself as a hero, versus like going and working to address poverty in your own community. It's going to be a lot harder to do that without being confronted by the fact that you're the problem.
Yeah, the Christians do the like missionary group, and I like they'll go to like Guatemala and do like this and that, and then they'll come back here and then close the borders to the people fleeing Guatemala and be like put them in detention centers. It's like, weren't you just trying to build a house for that same family? Like, what the fuck? Also, on the derogatory terms, snowflakes is used against people that are, and I'm like kind of about that term. Like, I want to like own it. I want to make like snowflake patches and be like, yo, I'm a snowflake. Fuck, dude. Like, what?
Jesse, will you explain what that term means to people who might not know?
I think it's just like they use it a lot about. I mean, I don't know these dudes using it. They're all bros and like misogynistic pigs, and they'll use it like if you complain about use of misogynistic terms, or just kind of anybody that like has a.
Hey, that's what we should call ourselves. We're like the revolutionary snowflakes.
Dude, I'm so down, like snowflake gang, dude. Like, fuck them. Just like take it and own it. Be like, yo, I'll tattoo that shit on my neck.
Maybe we need to rename ourselves as the Anti-Racist Snowflake Club.
Yeah.
Love it.
I do think to the point of like, we've hopped all over the place, but like dealing with conflict in like professionalism. I also think like what is respectable, or like what do you like, how are you allowed to participate in a respectful way, is really centered around what white people think is appropriate. And a lot of times white people are unable to deal with like confrontation or conflict in a way that's like healthy without like just immediately shutting down, becoming super defensive. And I think like it's almost like you're teaching like spoiled children, like how to communicate with one another for the good of all people involved. And like that requires a lot of self-reflection, a lot of like deep self-work. And I think that's why there's been like all these calls to like, you know, do the internal work of like, what does it look like to address my implicit biases? But we had, I mean, prior to like jumping on this call, we had a whole kind of dialogue amongst ourselves about, you know, is that enough to simply address your implicit biases? Is that what changes the world? And it's not, right? That's the beginning work and is ongoing and continual. But it also requires really tangible things. Like when you see someone saying something racist, or you see someone diminish or put down somebody who is making a very valid point in the workplace, to engage in that conflict, to engage in that confrontation, not in an aggressive or attacking way, but in a way that, you know, not only benefits the person saying it, yourself, but everyone included in the picture there. And being brave enough to do those things rather than shying away from that conflict. I think that's the idea of like fragility that gets brought up a lot when it comes to white culture. And so I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to respond to this question, does anyone do trainings like that? I had a friend share with me a resource about like specifically engaging in conversations in a productive way about like being white in the anti-racism movement. I'm going to drop that one here. This was co-created by a friend of mine, and then this website actually has these like guided conversations that you can have with folks for like hundreds of different topics that are really difficult to navigate sometimes. So I wanted to leave that here for us as well.
And I think within the conflict, there's also something to be said about the way that we police and moderate those conflicts based on like norms of white communication, and that if and when people step outside the norms of how white people feel comfortable communicating, then we like shut people down or end the conversation, or in a workplace setting say that the other person is being unprofessional because they're showing emotion. And I think that that's one thing that is really important that we understand, especially like when a lot of times we're in positions of power. And so we have the power to moderate the conversation, and instead of and because we have been the authors of writing these codes around professionalism and largely making them like the ways of being of white people is what it is to be professional. And if you exist outside of that, whether it's like your hair, body shape, style, or communication method, then you're unprofessional and it's inappropriate for you to be here. But that stuff is it's really deep, and it requires us to really do a lot of work, understand, like, you know, like really thinking about what it is in that moment that's making us feel uncomfortable, and really looking at, there's some great stuff out there. I shared it a while ago about like the characteristics of white culture, and they're largely things that are normalized in the workplace, that, you know, flag over and over and over again to people of color that professional spaces aren't spaces where they can be themselves.
And ultimately that hurts everybody, right? If
Absolutely.
somebody can't be themselves, they're not going to contribute in a way that's beneficial for anyone. And also, like, they're not going to last there. They're not going to stay there. Like, retention rates of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in major corporations is super low because the cultures are toxic and they don't want to be there.
Right.
They don't feel like they can be themselves, as Kate was saying. So, you know, I think a lot of times companies are like, well, Black people just didn't apply, so that's why.
Right. Or like, they weren't really the right kind of person here. It's like, well,
our culture
weird, these Black people didn't thrive in white supremacy work culture. Weird.
Have y'all seen Insecure?
No, I hear it's amazing though.
Oh my God, watch that immediately. And if somebody wants to plug the account, It's so good. It talks about these issues in such like an amazing, like comical and scary and beautiful way. Like it is an amazing show. It tackles a lot of these issues within the workspace.
Good. Yeah, I feel like that's a necessary show to be watching right now, right?
Oh yeah, I lost my HBO account, so I'm just like, damn it! Like the new season's out too.
If anybody wants to send Jesse their HBO logins, go for it.
Yeah. Oh, I changed my Instagram to Buffalo_bomber because I'm trying to avoid Big Brother. So if you want to follow me on there, like you can look for me up. And then I'm very critical about who I let follow me now, so be patient.
Well, I hope you're staying safe in Portland because I know shit's hitting the fan really hard there. And we're all very grateful for your participation on the front line.
No, I'm not. Yeah.
You're not being a protester, or being a person.
Yeah.
Anyway. Yeah, I don't know. There's another question in here. Do white Europeans feel more connected to their indigenous roots? And I feel like that's a really interesting question that I absolutely can't answer.
Yeah, I can't either. I'd have to like reach out and I mean, it doesn't seem like it, but like maybe there is like, I mean, I guess there is a lot of weird like white supremacist groups that have like appropriated like old Nordic shit, unfortunately. But like maybe there is like a community that actually is invested into that exploration. But
Yeah.
that'd be something to look into.
Go ahead. We have another question or a comment, I guess. I see it as a culture setting. So what are good ways to build culture together and still perform? Any resources there? These conversations are the right thing to do and they take time. So for the short-term productivity will go down would be expected, like talking about the process versus getting down to work to cut the grass, etc. Yeah, all of this is a very complex structure that needs to be dismantled, and those conversations take time. And I think white culture specifically really perpetuates the urgency of just get it done and get it over with, and so we can move on, instead of recognizing that these conversations we have to have in perpetuity. Like, you can't just like have a conversation about like the racist structures of your office setting and then address those and then wash your hands of, okay, cool, we're not racist. Like, they're going to continue. You're going to continue to have people who say racist things that perpetuate racism in knowing and unknowing ways. And those are things that are just going to have to constantly be addressed. And so maybe productivity does go down, and maybe that's okay. If that means that actually your organization is thriving in a way that is beneficial to everyone involved, instead of shifting into this, space where you can't retain Black, brown, and Indigenous folks.
And I think it's also a measurement of like, how are we measuring productivity? And so I think it's also a recalibration, because, and this goes back to like that, I was telling you about the post-traumatic slave syndrome by Joy Degree. She does a lot of great talk about this. But like, again, a lot of what she talks about is like how white people think about relationships as means to capital, whereas people of color think of the relationships as the capital. And so when that's your value system, there's a lot of miscommunication if like we're thinking that like, oh, we're just having this conversation so that we can get back to work, and you're thinking we're having this conversation because like we want to actually have a relationship. And I think that when we're thinking about like, what does it look like to be in relationship with one another in ways that are sustainable and generative, we need to think differently about how it is that we come to one another. And white people are exceptionally okay, so for me, this is the thing I do all the time. that I just like notice about myself, where I go to write an email and immediately I'm like asking people for stuff, telling them what to do. So, and then at the end of the meeting, when I go to sign it, I'm like, oh fuck, I didn't even say hi. And then I'll go back to the top of the email. I'm like, oh, hey, what's going on? Da, 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 da. Like, that's the thing where like, I know in myself, it's like, I'm just so fixated on the, like, this is like what we have to get done and da, da, da. But like, I'm not even being like, oh, hey, what's going on? Like, I know you are sick, or I know you are, you know, the thing, life things, human things. And we need to work on that. It's a big problem. And again, it comes back to when we were talking about capitalism and exploitation. This is the bread and butter of that, where we are so much more comfortable in the labor part of relationships and in the transactional part of relationships. You know, that those are the stepping stones for the normalization of exploitation between each other and the earth. Because once we know each other and care about each other, it's harder to be exploitive to one another.
Yeah. I don't know if this ties in, but like my favorite areas I've lived in have been like melting pots, like Oakland, and in parts of Los Angeles, where it's just like all these different cultures come together and they create their own culture. Like hyphy culture was created in Oakland, and that is just such a wild and crazy and like fun and like, I don't know, it's just like it's not about, there's too many races for it to be a race, you know, there's too many like genders and this and that. And I think melting pots are important. I think that that's the potential that we have moving forward, is to create these melting pots where this beautiful art and music and everything comes out of these melting pots. But you have to change the dialogue and change like the sphere of anything non-white, which is what everything is based around. And we also have to look at it as like not what parts of institutions or this or that is white supremacist. It's like we have to look at the entire system as based on foundational white supremacy, and everything from it is white supremacist. And I've been having conversations with people about defunding the police, and everybody's like, well, what if you have to call a cop about this? What do you have to call a cop about that? And it's like, well, most of the reasons that people have to call police were created in the beginning from white supremacy. And if we were to address all of the issues that add to like crime, then we wouldn't have to worry about that, because we would be addressing all the issues that create a criminal atmosphere.
Yeah, 100% of crime in areas is proportional to resource. So
yeah,
these
and
resource
also,
areas, yeah.
And how much crime is a direct result of parents being taken away and put into prison. You know, like if there is nobody at home to take care of the young ones, then that's going to create a problem. And so we got to stop taking the parents away. We got to figure out different systems to deal with criminals. You know, it's bullshit.
And also who it is that we criminalize, because it's not because
exactly.
Most of the people who are in prison are there for drug use, and I can tell you who's doing most of the drugs. It's not the people in prison. You know, many of the Black and brown people in my life, when they start spending time with white people in college, are horrified by our casual drug use, and the abundance of our casual drug use, and the inconsequential abundance of our casual drug use. Yeah.
I was dating a girl in New York, and she's like, oh, I have some cocaine in my bag. And I was like, you're not scared of getting rolled? She's like, what do you mean arrested? She had like no no fear of police at all, to think like, why would I be arrested? Like that didn't compute. It's just like, holy shit, privilege. Sorry.
I've been terrified of police my whole life. There's something interesting that I found, like there's multiple like statistics and studies that have shown that children begin to like perpetuate white supremacy in their thinking patterns by the age of 4. And that is not just white kids. That's kids of all races. have recognized that white is better. And I can't remember what clip it was, but this young girl asked her mom at some point, "Mom, when do I turn white?" Because she thought that she was being a good kid and therefore she would turn white.
Wow.
So this is just like, this is not something that's like getting better with time. Our kids are being conditioned just as we were conditioned and our parents were conditioned, that white is the supreme space and that, you know, it's better to be white. And so we still have, like, folks are like, oh, but the kids are so woke these days, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, actually, racism is getting worse in millennial generation. It's actually higher than it is in Gen X. So it's getting worse because these, you know, the ways in which we're communicating about race haven't changed. And so why would we expect the racism numbers to drop, right? Why would we expect the perpetuation of white supremacy and racist culture to change when we have not ourselves changed? And so we really have to continuously work to break down these barriers, which is interrupting white solidarity, interrupting these sorts of conversations, but also interrupting it within ourselves and in our thought pattern, right? Because it doesn't change if we don't stop thinking about things in those coded ways, right? And so we really have a lot of work to do. And so I'm grateful that everybody's here. And exactly, I think someone said the doll test. Yeah, it's like, which doll is the better, you know, doll, and all these kids pick the white doll. Mm-hmm. It's just a like horrifyingly sad way to recognize that we haven't done this work, you know, as a culture. And I think oftentimes white people believe, you know, think about this like individuality, like, oh, well, I haven't, you know, lit a cross on fire, therefore I'm not racist. And so therefore I'm absolved of having to talk about racism because I'm not racist. And it's, again, it's not that conversation of like whether you are racist or you're not. We're all racist and we all have to work to be anti-racist, but we often stop short of actually exploring, like, just because, and I think white individuality tends to be this precious thing that we all hold, right? It's like, well, there's racist white people, but I'm not one of those. But we're totally cool to generalize entire populations of people of color, right? Black people this, you know, brown people this. But like our understanding of race as white people is that race stuff is something that Black and brown people deal with because we don't have to deal with race because we don't have a race. We're just white, right? So like we're taught that we're taught that whiteness is the baseline or the centered race and like the normal, and that anything else that falls outside of that is complicated and hard and not something that we have to deal with because we're not racist. And so it's this individualism that really, you know, I think if we think about ourselves as like a race of people, white folks have a lot of work to do, and that includes all of us because we're not just, you know, we can't just look at the people burning crosses and be like, they're racist, but I'm not. Like, we all have it. It's all internalized. It's all part of our society. And so we really need to continuously dig that out and own it, you know? And that's hard to do. We've been taught to be fragile. We've been taught that we don't have to do this work. And
I think that can tie into if people have an issue with defunding the police, that means that they are completely unaware of what it feels like to be under the gun of the police. And so
absolutely.
If you're comfortable with the police the way it is, you are racist. And I guess like I want to tie that into we've been getting a lot shot at us, especially in the last week. Just kind of everything under the sun that's like a non-lethal munition. Sorry, I didn't. But a few prominent Black people have been targeted and shot in the head. And if they hadn't been wearing helmets, they would probably be dead right now. And these are good people. These are good people that just, these are actually the people talking about de-escalation, nonviolence, and defunding the police, and just Black Lives Matter. And these are really good, strong Black leaders that have been really mellow, good voices through this. And yes, I've been hurt through this. I've been hurt like what a lot of people consider badly, but I don't look at it that way. I look at it as George Floyd had his life extinguished by a knee on his neck for almost 9 minutes. Oscar Grant was shot in the back, unarmed. He has a daughter. Michael Brown was shot with his hands in the air. Brendan Glenn was shot in Venice Beach on his belly with his shirt off, unarmed. Breonna Taylor was murdered in her bed, asleep. So we can take all this shit that they're shooting at us, and we're not going to stop until this bullshit stops. And I want to encourage everybody, if you're scared, think about how scared Black people are being on the street daily. Fuck this. Like, they can shoot every fucking thing at me. I don't give a fuck. Like, we can't stop until this shit turns around. And like, if you're not, if it doesn't, if you don't see the emergency of that, then there's the white supremacy living in your brain. Sorry.
You don't ever have to apologize, Jesse.
Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Stay strong. Get on the streets. Are we done?
I think that's probably a good stopping point.
Sorry. I didn't know I was going to do that.
So important, though. Thank you.
Yeah. We're really grateful for everybody who's here, and you know, if you can get on the streets and protest and be present in these spaces and continue to push for these changes, you know, the issue at hand is that the conversation dwindles, and when the conversation dwindles, there's no pressure on the people who are changing or have, you know, being forced to make decisions to change things. So if there's no pressure on them, they don't have to change, and they can continue to uphold these white supremacist structures, right? So however you can best put pressure on people in positions of power, whether that's protesting, you know, however many ways that you can do this, we all encourage you to participate to the fullest capacity that you can.
Yeah, we need all the ways.
All the ways.
All the lanes head in the same direction. Use them all.
Yep.
Snowflake.
Snowflake gang. All right. Well, good night, everybody. I'll send out a newsletter in 2 days, and we'll do this again next week. Thank you so much for being here.
Love you all.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Hasta luego.